In the first sermon in this series a couple weeks ago, I talked about how by the time the Gospels were written down, Simon Peter was a well-known and deeply respected member by the early Christian church for his long and successful ministry as an evangelist, preacher, and religious leader. We considered if Simon Peter was known to be such a faithful and honored leader of the church, when it came time to write the gospel story down several years after his death, why did all four of the gospel writers record his story with his flaws and failures intact? Why didn't they sanitize his story, removing the embarrassing blunders so that his fitness for leadership was clear from the very start? Why not touch up his backstory a little bit and make a bigger deal of his successes rather than including every nitty-gritty detail of his failures? Best guess, as we talked about, is because he didn't. As he traveled about sharing the good news, helping establish new churches, and teaching the first generation of Christians, it appears that Simon Peter told his story of following Jesus in its entirety, with all his flaws and failures on full display. And he did so with a purpose in mind: to teach people new to Jesus or those considering becoming a Christian that one's imperfections and major screw-ups, whether they be in the past, present, or even future, were no barrier to being a disciple. And he found in the course of his discipleship that it turns out that the awkward questions, the confusing struggle to understand new teachings, and even the epic fails serve as excellent fodder for Jesus to do his best work of teaching, coaching, and transforming ordinary people into extraordinary agents of God's work. Perhaps the very best example of one of Peter's failed stories is the one that we read today. One needs only say Peter denies Jesus, and nearly anyone who's been to church, especially if you've come during Holy Week, would likely know the story that we're talking about. That time that Peter, despite being a disciple of Jesus, denies him 3 times when it matters most, even though he promised he wouldn't. And he failed so epically in his service to his Lord that day that he went out weeping bitter tears of remorse, sitting in the dirt in despair. All 4 gospel writers contain the story of Peter's denial, with some very minor differences, as well as the story of Jesus predicting that he would deny him. And what that tells us, when all 4 gospels have so much of the same story intact, means that this is the real deal story. It means that it not only definitely took place, but was probably really well known across the many communities from which the Gospels arose. The details of this story are so vivid and so well crafted, it's clear that Peter and the Gospel writers who eventually wrote it down took care to tell it in such a way that people would not only be captivated the first time they heard it, but would easily remember it long after they heard it. So let's take a closer look at this story that we've heard so many times possibly, and consider what Peter was hoping to convey to these early Christians. His story starts on the Mount of Olives, where he listens as Jesus shares that he's going to be betrayed that night. In actuality, he's already been betrayed at this point and simply awaits Judas's arrival with those who will arrest him. Matthew recounts Peter's quick declaration of loyalty. Lord, maybe everybody else will trip and fall tonight, but I will not. I'll be right there beside you. I won't falter. Well, Peter probably meant what he said in that very moment and had every intention of staying true. Jesus insists that is not how it's going to go down that night. Not only is Peter going to desert him, but he will deny him not once, not twice, but 3 times before the night is up and the early morning rooster crows his call. Peter refuses to accept this, just as he's refused to accept when Jesus says that he must die. He refuses to accept what Jesus said and boldly restates his loyalty. But this time, I won't deny you even unto death, Jesus. And it appears at this point that Peter really means that. All 4 Gospels recount that when the high priests show up with an entourage of soldiers and Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss, one of the disciples grabs a sword and swings it, cutting off the right ear of the high priest's servant, Malchus. Only John tells us it's Peter. Perhaps the other gospel writers at this point are trying to allow him to save a little bit of face in the midst of this story. But John doesn't pull any punches with Peter and names him as the one who tries to gallantly save the day for Jesus by employing all he's learned from his master and resorting to violence. Is that what you learned from Jesus, Peter? Jesus quickly admonishes this action because it's not what Jesus had taught Peter. And not only could Peter's action further inflame a very tense situation and frankly get everyone killed that night, which would sort of slow down Jesus' progress with his mission toward the cross and beyond, but more importantly, reminding him, this is not how I solve my problems. This is not how you as my disciple solve your problems. We don't use violence. We seek the peaceable kingdom. And according to Luke, not only does he admonish Peter, but just to make sure he gets a lesson, he heals the high priest's servant's ear before submitting peacefully to arrest. At this point, all Peter's story is demonstrating, as though he's trying his darndest, he is missing the mark of discipleship. He is missing what Jesus is asking him to do. He does not know what he is doing. And the prediction of his ultimate denial is still hanging over his head. So what should he do now? Well, now he decides, okay, I'm going to keep up with this courage. I'm going to try something different. I'm going to follow Jesus and those arresting him. I'm going to follow with John in the dark to where he's going to be interrogated. I'm not going to leave him. I'm going to stay. And it's worth emphasizing that at this point, Peter is showing great courage here. Though he has darkness and shadow to cover him, he is walking into the heart of danger, into the courtyard of the very people who have the power to decide Jesus' fate. And he is demonstrating loyalty that 10 other disciples are not able to demonstrate at this point. But we know how the story goes, thanks to the gospel sharing it in vivid detail. Despite the shadow of dark and a crowd to lose oneself, and pretty soon Peter is recognized and first called out personally. You were with Jesus the Galilean, weren't you? He's then identified publicly. That man over there, he was here with Jesus the Nazarene. And then he's confronted in front of everyone. Look, we know you must be one of his followers. You talk just like him. You sound like you're from the Galilee. All 4 Gospels record that when given the chance to own his association with Jesus and demonstrate this professed loyalty until death, 3 times Peter emphatically replies in the negative, insisting he's not who they say he is, and insisting he has nothing to do with Jesus. He's just another loiterer in the crowd on a dark night in the middle of the courtyard of the high priest where Jesus has been arrested. Makes sense. And as soon as that last denial is out of his mouth, as soon as the sun peeks up and the rooster crows, this famous story ends. The Gospel of John is the only one who leaves out that Peter responds by weeping bitterly as he realizes his defeat and his denial. Now, this moment is one that we would call rock bottom. And anyone who has really messed up has experienced rock bottom. Who here has had rock bottom? Like, it's okay, right? It's one thing to not understand some of Jesus' teaching and ask some silly questions to clarify. It's another to say, fall asleep while he's asked you to stay awake while he prays, like he did in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's even one thing to neglect to wash your feet when you showed up for dinner and have to have Jesus do it for you. But adamantly defending your undying loyalty to your master, who happens to be the Son of God, and then reneging on that promise not just once, but twice and 3 times, especially since later that night he's going to be flogged and mocked and crucified. Why would you share this story? And yet, Peter does. I imagine that those listening to Peter's story for the first time way, way back then would have experienced a little confusion at this point. How could someone who did that to Jesus? I mean, Judas also betrayed him, and Judas isn't hanging around in the church no more. How could this guy Peter, who's now sitting in front of me as a respected leader, even the bishop and eventually the pope of the church. How is this guy even sitting here telling me this story? Everything he has said has demonstrated that he is worthless instead of worthy, that he is faithless instead of faithful, a denier instead of disciple. He is totally unfit to serve Jesus. So how exactly did we get to here? If I had done what Peter had done, nobody would have ever let me forget it. Nobody would ever let me live it down. I would have never been forgiven. So how do we get from rock bottom with this guy Peter to him now being the rock upon which the church has been built? Well, we, several thousand years later, and who have the whole story, we know how it continues. We know that not 3 days later, it's Peter, who's been hiding away in fear and shame, I imagine, with the other disciples, who is running as fast as he can in the early morning light to see the empty tomb that Mary Magdalene has proclaimed, to see for himself the power of Christ to overcome death and be resurrected. And it's in that moment that Peter, his failure forgotten, experiences the appearance of Jesus, who sees him on the beach. We'll talk about that next week. And who calls him once again to follow. It's Peter, failure forgotten, who will go on to lead the disciples and the early church as it grows by leaps and bounds by the power of the Holy Spirit. And it's Peter, his failure forgotten, who will tell this whole story to anyone who will listen so that others will know that Jesus Christ will forget their failures just as he did for Peter. What Peter's audience would hear out of this, and what I hope we hear out of this, is that Jesus doesn't adhere to the school of thought that says you got to do it perfect the first time or forget it. No, Peter's story witnesses to the reality that Jesus is a second chance kind of guy, actually a third chance, a fifth chance, and so forth kind of guy, 70 times 7 kind of guy. And Peter's story, with all its gritty little details, was told so that gritty people who had their own gritty stories, who had likewise experienced failure even though none of them had cars at the time, that they too could believe their failures could be forgotten. That though the world might tell you that their failures would put them beyond the scope of God's providence, that instead there was grace for them from God that was abundant and endlessly forgiving. One doesn't tell a story so carefully crafted if one doesn't want people to not just remember it, but also to have them share it. The story isn't in here to make Peter seem great or famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, but to teach people a lesson that they can teach to others. We all fail. We fail each other, we fail ourselves, and we will, in the course of our lives, fail Jesus. And yet, he already knows that about us. He knows it because he lived among us. Because he spent 3 years with those scrappy disciples with all their silly questions and misunderstandings, and they're running away when the moment was right. And he wants us to understand and be able to share that instead of condemnation in the midst of our failures, Jesus offers understanding and forgiveness. And instead of writing us off as screw-ups, Jesus intentionally chooses to fulfill his mission in the world through us, a whole bunch of failures. His story teaches the followers of Christ back then and now that there's power in our stories of failure. There's power in the story of failure when it is shared with someone honestly, with all the little gritty details of how we came to the moment of rock bottom, but also how through Christ we rose. And that those stories, when they're told honestly, when we don't try to have a veneer as Christians of being perfect people who are totally complete and have it all together, when we share our stories of nitty-gritty failure with others, we help them see that there is space too for you in the body of Christ. And not just a seat for you, but a mission for you, a calling for you, because it just turns out that Jesus Christ works best with people who don't have it all worked out. Pastor Pat and I often talk about our sermons to help each other not be epic homiletic failures. And so earlier this week, I was talking to him about, okay, like there's so much going on in this story. How do I How do I leave a nugget for people to take with them? And he said, well, I really wish I was preaching this week because I have a story that I want to tell. And so I want to tell a story that Pastor Pat wanted to tell to you that he would have used in his sermon today. And it's called What is the Meaning of Life? And it comes from a guy named Robert Fulghum. He's an American author. You might know his book, All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Does anybody know that? Okay, there's some nodding heads. Okay. So he tells a time when he attended a lecture given by a Greek philosopher and teacher who ended his talk by asking the usual question, are there any questions? And sitting in the audience, Fulghum raised his hand and asked, Dr. Papaderos, what is the meaning of life? Now, Fulghum relates that the usual laughter followed and people started to pack up and go, thinking that he wasn't being seriously. But Papaderos held up his hand and stilled the room and looked at Fulghum for a long time and asking with his eyes if he was serious, seeing that he was, said, I will answer your question. Then taking out his wallet from his hip pocket, he fished into it and he brought out a very small mirror, about the size of a quarter. And he told the story of when he was a small child during the war, they were very poor. He lived in a remote village, and one day on the road, he found several pieces of broken mirror from the motorcycle of a Nazi. He tried to fit all the pieces and put them back together, but it just wasn't possible, so he kept just the largest piece, the one that he was sharing. And by scratching it on a stone, he made it round. He began to play with it as a toy and became fascinated by the fact that he could reflect light into dark places where the sun would not shine because of walls or something blocking it, into deep holes and crevices and even dark closets. It became a game for him, as they were locked in seclusion from fear of the Germans, to get light into the most inaccessible places he could find. And he kept that little mirror, and as he kept growing up and so forth, he would take it out in idle moments and continue the challenge of the game wherever he was at. But as he became a man, he grew to understand that this was not just a child's game, but a metaphor for what he might do with his life. He came to understand that he's not the source of light. He is not light himself, but light, truth, understanding, knowledge of God, is there, but it will only shine in dark places if I reflect it. He says, I'm a fragment of a mirror whose whole design and shape I do not know. Nevertheless, with what I have, I can reflect light into the dark places of this world and change some things for people that they might otherwise experience. Perhaps others may see me doing that and likewise do the same. This is what I'm about. This is the meaning of life. And then he took his small little mirror, holding it carefully, caught the light of the sun streaming through the windows in the classroom, and he reflected the light onto Fulghum's face and onto his hands folded on his desk. I think this is what Peter figured out as he started his ministry. He figured out that he could use his experience of the light being shined on him in the midst of the darkness and shadow of his failure. And he could use it not only to shine the light into the corners of other people's failure and shadows, but he could teach them how to do the same. For people who knew the power of light being shined in the midst of despair and grief and denial and so forth. And so he dedicated his life to sharing that story in all its detail, that the light might be reflected to as many people and beyond. We as Christians today, we inherit that little mirror and that tradition from Peter. Every single one of us, as you demonstrated enthusiastically during the passing of the peace, has a story of failure to share. Probably some much more painful to reveal than backing through a garage door or locking your keys in it. Right? And these shadow stories of ours, it's not where we shine the brightest, right? I mean, it's where our mess-ups are on full display, but it is a place where God's love shines the brightest. Where even though we seem unworthy To reflect it, we are the perfect vessels by which God would have it shine. And I think that's why Peter told the whole story. And I think it's why we make sure we tell that story every Holy Week. To witness to the world that Christians aren't perfect, for one, but that the light of Christ is best used when it illuminates the shadows of our human failures, and that Christ is the one who chooses to use our humanity to reflect that light, to allow us to be powerful vehicles for sharing that light into the shadows of other lives, so that all can receive the good news. So, let us accept this story from Peter. Let us thank him for his witness as a failure. And let us be failures with him and with each other. But let us also be mirrors. I believe both are a calling for which we are made worthy through Christ. And that's pretty good news, if you ask me. Hallelujah? Hallelujah. Amen. I'll invite you to rise and